My name is Richard Johnson. I'm a senior lecturer in politics at Queen Mary University of London. I'm one of the authors of Keeping the Red Flag Flying, the Labour Party in Opposition since 1922. This is the first book to look at the history of Labour since it first became the official opposition. We argue that opposition is not just dead, wasted time, but is absolutely vital to Labour preparing itself for government. And so I hope that if you want to understand what a Labour government will do, you need to understand what Labour does in opposition.
Hello and welcome to the We Are Labour podcast. I am Dan Greef, your host, and this is the show that highlights our amazing Labour candidates and the constituencies we need to win to form the next Labour government. As you hear the stories and experiences from our candidates, I want you to think, how can you help? What can you do to make the difference? Can you go and leaflet, knock on doors, donate money, or phone canvass voters? By giving a little of your time and or money, it will make a massive difference. This election will be won by Labour members doing our bit to help get the Labour message of hope out to our communities. Let's crack on with the show. Hey everyone, welcome to We Are Labour. I am buzzing with excitement because the show I've just recorded just this moment with Dr. Johnson has been absolutely spectacular. Now, the whole purpose of this show, I should introduce the show, sorry. Welcome to We Are Labour, the podcast where we highlight the stories, the campaigns of our PPCs. This show is very different, however, but it's still a really important and valid show because there's a book coming out, and Richard is one of the main authors on this book, and it's Keeping the Red Flag Flying, the Labour Party in Opposition since 1922. It's coming out this weekend, so you can get yourself a copy now if you wish, and it's looking at the very important history of the Labour Party, and as it says in the title of the book, in opposition. And it's looking at 6 different elements to that time in opposition, how the party is formed in that time, how it gets itself ready for the next government. It's a fantastic book. Well, I haven't read it yet, but the conversation certainly we just had about the book was fantastically insightful. So Richard and I, in this episode, we go through some of the themes that come up when Labour's in opposition. We then cover 100 years worth of history by going through different opposition leaders and the party at the time, and what were the debates and the conversations going on. We also look at the pattern, the resonance that has a connection between these different periods of opposition. It is a fascinating conversation. Dr. Richard Johnson is incredible. I used to know him from when his time at Cambridge here, where I am, and we're part of the same, obviously, Cambridge CLP. And he was always a superb speaker, and he used to come and talk to us at our GC meetings and do extra events for the party as well. He was a great mind, really is. And it's such a privilege for me to be able to share this with all of you. So I hope you enjoy this episode. I hope it's kind of insightful. Maybe a lot of this stuff you know already. There's certainly things that I learned today, and I'm sure you will as well. And he also very kindly did donate a song, which I now have the chance to go and find it somehow on Spotify because it's not one I've ever heard of before, for our playlist. So if you are listening to this while you're leafleting, I hope you have a nice, safe and happy leafleting round listening to this story. Or if you're on your way to a canvas session, this is in your ears right now, enjoy it. But even if you're on the way to work and do something a bit boring like that, I hope this brightens your day. Take care, everyone. I'll now hand over to Dr. Richard Johnson. Well, I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Richard Johnson, lecturer at Queen Mary University London, and his book, Keeping the Red Flag Flying, the Labour Party in Opposition since 1922, is about to be released. It's actually coming out on the 20th. Is that right, Richard?
Yes, just a few days
away. There you go.
away.
So you can get your copy very, very soon. Welcome to We Are Labour. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan. Looking forward to it.
This feels like a little bit of a small reunion as well, because I've actually seen you in person for a long, long time. Well, you're in New York, so it's not really in person, is it? But it's the most in-person interaction we've had for many years. So how have you been? I mean, you've been in Lancaster, you've now in London. Your career seems to be going from strength to strength, and you're on a tour of America as well. So tell us a bit about the things you've been up to.
Yeah, it's never a dull moment. I mean, it's interesting. I've been a Labour Party member since 2009, and I was active in Cambridge at first as a student. I was chair of the University Labour Club, and then hung around in Cambridge, helping the CLP for many years. And I remain very interested in Labour politics, but I have also more recently become integrated my love of Labour history into my academic work. So I do a lot of American politics and American political history, but it's only in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years that I've done more British politics and Labour Party history, and that this book comes out of that kind of move as well.
Okay, so let's go into the book itself then. So you co-authored this book with Mark Garnett and Gavin Hyman. And this is, I mean, it's an interesting book to think about the Labour years in opposition rather than government, because, you know, I used to be a history teacher. We always look at governments. We don't really look at the opposition unless it's in relation to the government. So what's the origins behind this book being made in the first place?
Well, a few years ago, I was still living up in Lancaster, and next to Lancaster is Morecambe, which is a fantastic seaside town. And as this is a PPC podcast, I have to give a shout out to Lizzie Collins, who's the Labour candidate in Morecambe, who I think will be a fantastic MP. And I hope anyone who lives near Morecambe goes up and helps her in her campaign. But in Morecambe is the Morecambe Winter Gardens, which is an absolute gem of kind of traditional British seaside architecture. It's host to, in its heyday, great actors and music acts and so on. And then, as was the case with so many seaside towns, especially when people could take cheap holidays overseas, it kind of faded and had to close. And it's in the last few years that the Morecambe Winter Gardens has been restored through a kind of community trust and a lot of volunteers and community effort, and they've received some funding, which has been fantastic. And I love going to the Winter Gardens, and I'd always take people there. And I knew that the Labour Party had once held its annual party conference in Morecambe at the Winter Gardens. In fact, it only did it once in the party's entire history, and that was in 1952. And we were coming up to the 70th anniversary of that conference, and I was the political education officer of Lancaster CLP, and I said, why don't we in Morecambe CLP put on an event, a fundraiser, but also an event that will help to kind of bring that conference alive. And it was a very interesting Labour conference because it was the first conference after the Attlee government had fallen, and the Labour Party was trying to assess really what to make of that government and what to do about its positioning in the years to come. There was an argument from some that the Attlee government was the pinnacle of socialist achievement. It had created the welfare state, and the job of the Labour Party was to defend those achievements, to defend that government, to defend that record. And that's what Labour's mission going forward was. But there were others who said that the government lost its way, that it wasn't as radical as it could have been. Famously, 3 members of the Attlee government resigned over the budget of the Chancellor, Hugh Gaitskell, those being Nye Bevan, Harold Wilson, and John Freeman. And it's quite something, really, for these members of the government to resign over a budget. You know, it's a very destabilizing thing. But they came to Morecambe, these Bevanites, these supporters of Nye Bevan, and they said that they wanted, Labour to go left. And the party delegates, and actually another nice little side note of that, my grandfather was a delegate at that conference.
Oh, wow, what a piece of personal history that is.
Exactly. It's a nice thing to be in that room and think that he gave a speech at that conference in favor of comprehensive education. He was very passionate on that issue. But the delegates there agreed with the Keep Left group and the Bevanites. And so it was a clearing out of the old guard. Some of the members of the NEC who'd been on there for decades, who'd been kind of significant party stalwarts like Herbert Morrison and Hugh Dalton, lost their seats on the NEC, and left-wing radicals like Bevan and Barbara Castle and Wilson got onto the NEC. And so this bust up at Morecambe kind of became legendary. So I held this event. It was fun. It went really well. We had people in the CLPs who acted different roles from the conference. We had the Pathé film reels. We had someone volunteer to play the old musical organ. It was great. John McDonnell came and gave the keynote speech.
Wow.
And after that event, two of the people in the audience who had been colleagues of mine at Lancaster University before I moved to Queen Mary, Mark Garnett and Gavin Hyman, came to me and said, we should write something about this. And Mark in particular had said, there's never been a book on the history of Labour in opposition. There is actually a book on the history of the Conservative Party in opposition. He said this is a big gap because actually Labour has spent a lot of time in opposition. And actually opposition can be very meaningful and impactful for the direction of travel that the Labour Party goes. And indeed, that was sort of the theme of John McDonnell's speech at the event. So that's it's a bit of a long-winded roll into that, but I think that sets some of the themes that then we picked up on as we wrote the rest of the book.
Wow, fantastic. What a story. The thing I've just reflected on when you're talking was that 1945 to 51 government has become kind of like a bit of a myth and a legend now. Obviously not to historians, but I mean to Labour Party members. That is, in many regards, a benchmark for how government should be. And it's just interesting how we don't really, I think, as members, reflect so much on the falling out of Morecambe in 52 and the years that we were in the wilderness suddenly until we came back to power. So it's kind of interesting how we don't really think about the conflict in that period. And yet that is so important to the next steps the party takes.
Absolutely. And the thing that struck me in writing this book is that pretty much every time Labour loses office, there's a big bust up over what to make of the previous Labour government from the Labour Party's perspective. And in effect, the party always seems to divide between those who want to defend the record of the previous Labour government and those who want to attack the record of the previous Labour government for being insufficiently radical. And even that government, which, as you say, Dan, is mythologized so much in the Labour Party today, there was a significant wing of the party that believed that it was too cautious and that it didn't go far enough, and that it sold out certain principles. I mean, Bevan resigned because he didn't believe that there should be any money charged at all in the health service. And so when Hugh Gaitskell, as the Chancellor, introduced charges for not really luxury goods, but eyeglasses and false teeth and things like that, and making those means tested, Bevan said, "This is not socialism. This is not what we, that's not what the meaning of the National Health Service is." So these conflicts happen every time Labour loses office.
Okay, so in that case, I'm going to go, if I may, through a few different periods, and I kind of feel like the McDonnell government is something that, well, governments is something that we don't always understand. Well, I don't know a massive amount about it. So we know that, for instance, so your book starts in 1922, of course, before the 1924 government, which is only 259 days or so that McDonnell was in office. And then, of course, he's back again in 1929, and again, as a national government. What was the opposition like after that period? Because it must have been a bit of unrealization that maybe all the dreams of what a socialist Labour movement could achieve in government was nothing like what they had hoped and dreamed for. I mean, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I imagine there must be a massive amount of disappointment and not really understanding what those governments achieved. Or am I being a bit harsh?
No, I mean that those disputes were certainly there. I mean the first Labour government. So just in terms of let me just say in terms of the starting date of the book. So there is actually some debate as to whether we've started in the correct year or not. So we say we started in 1922, which is when we believe Labour properly became the official opposition, right? His Majesty's loyal opposition. This is the first election Labour came second, both in terms of the votes and seats in Parliament. But in 1918, oddly enough, although Labour came fourth in that election, because there was this coalition between the Liberals and the Conservatives, and the Irish MPs didn't take their seats, Labour actually was the second largest non-governmental party that took its seats in 1918. But basically, it didn't take up the responsibility, we argue, of official opposition, of being that alternative government until 1922, when Ramsay MacDonald actually defeats in a leadership challenge the the previous Labour leader, John Robert Clines. And it's the only time in Labour history where an incumbent leader loses a leadership challenge. So MacDonald comes in, he becomes the first Labour leader of opposition. And then just 12 months later, there's that late 1923 election that then sets Labour up to come in the January of 24 as government. And so this is such a huge change. Labour's only just been the official opposition for a matter of months, and now it's the government, and it's a minority government, and there's all this kind of expectation that's placed on it, especially from the Labour membership, who just see everything happening in rapid revolutionary terms. And you have to think about the wider context as well, with the Bolshevik Revolution, and there's a lot of change going on around the world. And then the government actually does very little, because it's a minority government. It only has about a third of the seats in Parliament. It's extraordinary to think it thought it could be a government at all, really. Doesn't go into coalition with the Liberals because they'd been in coalition with the Tories very recently, and there was no
history repeats again, eh?
I know it's really quite something. And so the one thing that government does do is it passes a housing bill, which leads to a lot of council housing being built. It's the first housing bill that requires indoor plumbing for council housing, things like that. But that's basically it. And so after Labour loses the 1924 election, the end of 1924, there are huge recriminations. And the left of the party basically says, the reason we didn't achieve more is because MacDonald didn't want to achieve more. And they try and push him out. And they try and put George Lansbury, who was a left-wing East London MP. Lansbury and Jeremy Corbyn, I think, actually share quite a lot in common. They're kind of these romantic, long-standing figures of the party who are always kind of constant rebels and then occasionally find themselves in positions of responsibility, not quite sure what to do with them. And but Lansbury says, no, I'm not going to challenge him. He turns them down and basically scuppers it. But if Lansbury had said, I'm going to take him on, MacDonald could have been out, and the history of the party might have been very different, because maybe George Lansbury might have won the next general election, which was 1929. Labour wins again. But basically, after the first Labour government and the second one, because then MacDonald then goes into coalition with the Tories and forms this national government. I mean, there really is a sense of betrayal from the grassroots after that. So these narratives that Labour comes into government, doesn't do what it should do, and sells out, are embedded in the culture of the party from the very beginning.
See, the strange thing is, though, I would say that the early 30s government, I mean, with the move away from the gold standard, the economic challenges that they were going through, was probably quite successful in terms of a historian outside of the party looking at it. So I sort of think this is a really interesting theme we're looking at, is how members understood, and maybe it's the first time they actually analysed what the purpose of the party was, because we have the general strike, etc., and all these big events going on with more, I guess you could say, left-wing revolutionary type ideas. Yet the gradualism, the parliamentary democracy that the party was trying to pursue was much more of a slow-paced change. And I just wonder if there's like some sort of trying to get to the heart of what the party was about and what it was there for. And that was probably our first time of having that conversation, because we had been in government. We had something to work on and reflect on, rather than just a dream for the future.
Yes, so we think that Labour faces certain common challenges every time that it goes into opposition. And so the book actually applies 6 common challenges across each of these chronological periods. One is assessing the record of the previous Labour government. The second is reforming the party's internal machinery and rule book. The third is adopting or reforming or revising its policy agenda. What policies will the next Labour government champion? The fourth is holding the government of the day, the Tory government, to account, actually being the official opposition in Parliament and in the country. The fifth is winning the support of the public and building an electoral coalition that will bring you into government. And the final one is managing relations with the trade unions. And actually this period, the first time, from 24 to 29, this first time when Labour's in opposition after having lost government, it's doing all of these things. And the conferences that Labour has are debating, are debating policy, but they're also debating, what's their relationship with the Communist Party. What is their relationship with the far left? There's debates about, should Labour's champion electoral reform? How do we appeal to the public? Do we focus just on kind of our core working class support, or do we try to branch out to more middle class electorates? So these are very familiar debates, I think, for anyone who's involved in the Labour Party today. And these are very much the same types of debates that the Labour Party was having even in the 1920s.
Yeah, fantastic. So can I skip forward a little bit then and talk about Gaitskell and his time in opposition? I mean, very interesting character, Gaitskell. You think that he could have potentially have been a prime minister if he had lived long enough. But it seems to me that the 50s is probably where the international development of the Soviet Union and American politics, the way that that's going, the Cold War is definitely going to influence the conversation in our own country. But he actually tried to change or remove Clause 4, didn't he, in the Constitution? Which seems to me exactly one of those 6 points you're saying there about reorganizing the actual structure and the rule book of the party. And I, of course, I can see resonance there with Tony Blair and what he did in the 90s. So can you tell us a bit about Gaitskell and kind of that period of opposition? What was going on there alongside the Clause 4 changes that he was trying to get through?
Yeah, so the Morecambe 1952 conference very much sets up the battle lines for the rest of the decade. Now, Clement Attlee stays on as Labour leader until another election defeat in 1955. And I think Attlee probably did stay on too long, but it's curious. At the time, Attlee was such a beloved figure, really from all wings of the party. He was respected both on the left and the right of the party, that there wasn't much talk of challenging him, actually. And so people just kind of let him stay on as long as he wanted. Even after 1955, Labour losing that election, people thought Attlee might stay on. Even then, he was Labour leader for 20 years.
Incredible.
Quite incredible. But eventually, Attlee does stand down at the end of 1955, and Gaitskell, who had been the Chancellor in the previous Labour government, wins the leadership, and he's seen as a figure on the right of the centre of the party, and his great nemesis is Aneurin Bevan on the left of the centre of the party. And there are these huge conflicts over nuclear arms, Britain's international position, and also on, again, reflecting on the legacy of the government. And Gaitskell sees himself very much as a modernizer. He thinks that the Labour Party, there's a theory going around in British sociology of what they call the embourgeoisement of British society, the sense that the working class are now, because of the welfare state, Labour has actually sowed the seeds of its own electoral destruction, because working class people now are not in abject poverty. They actually have stable homes and good jobs and can see a doctor, and their kids are getting good educations. And so why do they need to vote for the Labour Party? They can all just be Tories, and this was part of Gaitskell's fear, was that if Labour doesn't change with society, that its success in policy terms will make it irrelevant in electoral terms. And so Gaitskell sets out to reform the party from within, and he argues that Labour needs to abandon its Clause 4 commitment to the nationalisation or common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, this kind of old-fashioned socialist language of basically a command and control economy, and that Labour needs to make itself a modern party. Now, what really happens, I guess, are two important developments, two deaths in a sense. One is Bevan dies in 1960, and so the Labour left then ends up finding a kind of new figure to lead them, which is Harold Wilson. But Wilson is not as doctrinaire as Bevan. He's much more ideologically flexible. But Wilson challenges Gaitskell for the leadership in 1960 and fails. But then Gaitskell dies in January of 1963, very suddenly. It's like John Smith's death. It comes out of the blue. It really shocks people. And then Wilson wins the leadership election to replace Gaitskell. But Wilson, although Wilson was an enemy of Gaitskell, Wilson did adopt Gaitskell's view that Labour had to be a modernising party and had to be the party of the future. And so Wilson, coming from the left of the party, admittedly, but also adopts the language that the right of the party had been using, which is about reform, that we can't use his famous Labour Party conference speech about the white heat of the technological revolution. In that speech, indeed, in that very same paragraph that he's speaking, he says that we can't keep to the old practices of before. And he says, including in industry. So he's saying that I'm a reformer and I'm not just going to do what the old fashion trade union left-wing line is going to be. I'm going to be someone who brings in technology and modern practices across government and in society.
Wow, fascinating. There seems to be a bit of a theme there as well, where we have leaders coming from the left of the party and then moderating themselves because when you said about Attlee being in power for so long as the leader of the opposition and leader of the Labour Party, it made me think that actually Wilson was seen as a unifying candidate as well, who also in 70 to 74 was kept in position as leader of the Labour Party, even though he'd just lost an election. So it's just an interesting sort of theme there, not with all of our leaders, not especially recently, but there does seem to be a lot of leaders who come from the left who then realise they have to modernise. And this is the other thing I find interesting. These periods of opposition seem to be, and it feels very much like this now, I'd say, another resonance as well, that we are very much looking at technology and the future. That seems to be a very common theme, that we sort of look at where we are and go, now it's about AI, for instance, and how technology can help the NHS or, our services. It looks like Wilson was very much looking to the future of the country based on technology in the 60s and the late 50s and what that was about. Even Tony Benn was kind of seen as being somebody who embraced technology and communications. So it seems like we're always reflecting on the future and how we can use that technology to make the next Labour government more effective and efficient at helping people.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a real fashion, I suppose, in the mid 20th century for kind of scientific socialism, right? And that socialists could use the methods of research science to improve people's livelihoods and to make work more efficient. And it wasn't, people weren't really afraid of science. I mean, they were very excited by it. And you're absolutely right. But Tony Benn was seen as very much part of this kind of vanguard. I mean, Benn actually started his political career as a bit of a Gaitskellite. But I think it was because Benn was attracted to Gaitskell's discussion about Labour needing to be a modernising, forward-thinking party. So both the left and the right, this is a unifying language, and I think probably even today, I think that kind of discussions, as you mentioned, Dan, about AI and the future of work and what that means for the welfare state as well as for the nature of work is something that all wings of the party, I think, would be interested in being part of that discussion. It's not one, I think, that lends itself so easily to factionalism in the way that some other issues do.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that somebody here locally to Cambridge was saying to me, that he thinks that Labour will come into power next general election. Who knows exactly, but let's hope so. But they might be in office only for one term. And I said, well, actually, looking at the history, that's, apart from MacDonald, that's not that common at all. And of course, Wilson's government does lose in 70 to 74 to Heath. But it's interesting how it seems to me that every time Labour does lose, in I think 2010, I certainly felt this way. I felt like, oh, well, we'll be back again next general election. It's just we're out of office for one term. This is just us a chance to get ourselves sorted out and back to, being ready for government again. But it does seem that when the government takes over from another party, that party does seem to be in power for a long time. So can I just reflect briefly on the sort of the opposition of 70 to 74 and how realistic is it that we sort of think to ourselves we are going to come back into office that soon? Because that is incredibly rare to happen, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's very rare. And, the 1970 election defeat took many people by surprise. Labour had won a substantial landslide, really, in 1966. And although there was a very difficult period for Labour in government, there was a sense that it had been a fairly productive government, and just the scale of the parliamentary majority made people feel that it was unlikely the Tories were going to win a majority just in one electoral cycle. Harold Wilson as well, I think, took that defeat quite badly personally, and he was quite surprised by it. But actually, he should get a lot of credit for what he did in that period of office, where he managed. There was certainly that you can see in that 1970-74 period. You can see the common motif, the left of the party starting to come out and say, we weren't radical enough. We need to be more radical. There was a document passed in 1973, Labour's Agenda 1973, which called for the next Labour government to seize control of the 25 biggest companies in Britain.
Wow, that's pretty left wing.
It actually, that's how Jeremy. That's one of Jeremy Corbyn's early bits of Labour activism. He was part of that conference of that. But actually, what Wilson had been very successful, both as a prime minister but also managing his shadow cabinet, is bringing in the plurality of the party on board, and so his front bench was always very ideologically mixed. He had people who were from the right of the party, he had people from the left of the party, he had people somewhere in between. He would often in government, he would stagger ministries. So there might be a left-wing Secretary of State, but there might be a more right-wing Minister of State underneath, and vice versa, and so on. He was very, very skilled with that. And what that meant, I think, is that when Labour went into opposition from 1974, kind of everyone had dipped their hands in blood. Everyone was part of the credit or blame, for better or for worse. And so Labour couldn't erupt in the factional battles quite in the same way that it had in other periods. And Wilson was always very skilled at knowing where to pick battles, but also where not to pick battles. And some people could say Wilson kind of stored up problems for himself later on. One example of this, of course, is it's in that 70-74 period that Wilson announces his support that there should be a referendum on membership of the European Economic Community. Now, this is remembered as a great strategic move by Wilson because this was an issue that was tearing apart the Labour Party in opposition. Heath brought Britain into the passed the European Communities Act in 1972. Labour had a 3-line whip proposing it, but something like 80 or 90 Labour MPs voted in favour of it. And Wilson just said, look, when we get into government, we're just going to ask the public to tell us what to do on it. And we remember this as a great strategic move because he won the referendum and he's, his government carried on. But of course, it was a gamble and it could have gone the other way. And we could remember this as Wilson basically is great folly. I mean, if David Cameron had won the 2016 referendum, I think he'd be remembered very differently for that. So Wilson was pretty good at managing the party, but you have to take risks in doing that as well, and he got lucky.
I totally agree. It's interesting though that he left again so soon after winning in 74. I was in 76. He left office, and we now know about his health issues around that. Although we also know more about his personal life for the last few days, right? Which we didn't know previously. Okay, so I find it interesting then that there seems to be these big rivalries in our party, and I sometimes wonder how much of that is ideological and how much of that like just the egos of politics. So I was just noticing that you've got McDonald versus Maxton, who I know was independent Labour, but still there's a big rivalry there. Gate School versus Bevan, you were saying. We know that there was Ben versus Healy in the early 80s for the deputy leadership. Brown and Blair, I guess, not really in the same league. They're kind of ideologically linked, but how much is that kind of personal ego and a Brownite and a Blairite to me now seem pretty similar, but then I guess you'd still say that felt like there were two camps at the time. How much personalities and how much is ideology?
I mean, personality plays an important role, but I think that you're right. The Blair Brown one is one that ideology doesn't feature as much, although often there would be policy disagreements between the two on sometimes important issues like the euro, for example. But you're right. There are these great battles, and again, with Wilson, when Gaitskell died, the right of the party was initially the kind of leadership of that was taken over by George Brown, who now everyone only seems to remember because he was he was an alcoholic and sort of the kind of funny or outrageous stories about him. But he was also seen, as a very kind of serious figure of the time, and Wilson quite wisely, makes George Brown his first secretary, makes him kind of his, in effect, deputy prime minister to kind of bring him on board. The 80s, of course, as you mentioned, Dan, is remembered very much for the Benn-Healey split. And of course, the left of the party become known as the Bennites, just as the left of the party in the 50s had been known as the Bevinites. And some people on the left at the time believed that Tony Benn was being egoistic or personally self-indulgent with his challenge of Healey. One figure I've just finished writing a chapter on for a book, an edited collection of essays, is Judith Hart, who's now mostly forgotten, but she was a left-wing cabinet minister under Wilson and Callaghan, and then she was chair of the NEC in the early 80s, and she was chair of the NEC as Benn was challenging Healey, and she agreed with basically everything that Benn said, but she said, this is completely unnecessary. Who cares who the deputy leader is, in effect? And what you're basically doing is you're delegitimizing the policies that I agree with you on by making them all about themselves. She said to him something like, these policies do not belong to you. And I think that you've hit your nail on the head a bit, that there is a pattern in Labour of figures both on the left and the right who will fight ideological battles, and certainly they believe in those issues, but they're also using them for reasons of personal advancement as well, and you can't escape that.
Yeah, which I guess that is just defining politics in all parties. That's going to happen, isn't it, to some extent? Yes. Although I do think Wilson's the interesting outlier in the way that you said that he was able to mix his party together to make it work well. I think that's incredibly skillful, and I think in some ways there's a lesson there for us in the Labour Party that it is about bringing people together. The thing about the first past the post system, voting system in our country is that all our parties are fairly broad churches, aren't they? And the leader who can make all the parts work together for the common goal of winning elections and delivering Labour policy, that's a key skill we need in any leader, isn't it? Which is important. May I just go on to ask you about another thing? I was just thinking about international influence, I guess, on us in opposition. So talk about Gaitskell, and I was just thinking about, there must have been around the time of Suez, and I think there's controversy around kind of how the opposition leader either supports the prime minister. So Foot, for instance, very much supported Thatcher going to the Falklands. I think Gaitskell's seen as somebody who said he supported the government but didn't support the government. Is about the UN route, and about that was a very tricky time for us. I feel like there's kind of that existential stuff outside of the UK that sometimes definitely influences, and we see it in a modern day Labour Party, what's going on obviously in the international world right now with incidents and how that affects us as a party. So yeah, what sort of, I don't know how to phrase this question, how does that theme influence the way that we are in opposition?
Well, you're right. Foreign policy is very difficult for the official opposition to manage, in a sense. In our system, the official opposition's role is usually to oppose what the government of the day is doing, for the most part. But when it comes to foreign policy, sometimes that's not as straightforward, because it may be that they're seen as if not an objective British foreign policy interest, a certain sense that there might be matters of national concern that should call for unity. And as you mentioned, Suez and the Falklands are interesting examples. Falklands in particular, I think, is quite interesting because one might expect Michael Foot, who's on the kind of from the left of the party, was a lifelong, used to go on the CND marches and camp out to oppose nuclear armament, and was sort of seen as an anti-militarist. But was actually his criticism, where he criticized the Thatcher government, was that they hadn't done enough to protect the Falkland Islands and that they should have kept a battleship there. Actually, people forget this. Callaghan had a battleship patrolling the Falklands, and then Thatcher got rid of it, which is what helped Galtieri's make the invasion. So Foot's speech is basically, we should have a bigger military presence around the Falklands. Sometimes foreign policy, so sometimes that means that Labour isn't opposing, and that can make people in the Labour Party grumpy about Labour supporting the Tories, and you see that time and time again. But sometimes foreign policy is also used by Labour leaders to try to give themselves a sense of legitimacy back home. So you see this, for example, with in two ways with Neil Kinnock. Kinnock goes to America and tries to meet with Ronald Reagan and does get a meeting in the Oval Office with Reagan. And at the time, Dennis Healey is Shadow Foreign Secretary, and they go in together, and it's a disaster. They get into an argument over nuclear weapons. Ronald Reagan was clearly badly briefed, or he just had a bad memory because he thought Dennis Healey was the British ambassador. So he says, "Nice to see you again, Mr. Ambassador." It doesn't help raise the status of Neil Kinnock. On the other hand, Kinnock has very good relations with Jacques Delors, the president of the European Commission, and also with François Mitterrand, the president of France. And so Kinnock would often use his connections with European leaders as a way of showing that he was respected on the world stage, which was kind of then used as a soft critique of Thatcher, saying she wasn't respected on the world stage, but also helped with this kind of elusive quality of being seen as prime ministerial, which so many leaders of the opposition want to be seen as. And Kinnock in particular often struggled with that image because of the way that the press presented him. I also think actually quite a lot of class snobbery against Kinnock, and also being from Wales, that snobbery as well. And so foreign policy was a way that he tried to elevate his status as someone who could be a prime minister.
For sure. I mean, I think that era, we've not mentioned it as yet about Kinnock. I mean, the place he took the party from until when he left is really significant. And Tony Blair was saying with Keir Starmer in an interview about a year ago, saying that, he had Kinnock and then he had John Smith. And then, of course, Blair could come in and do his reforms to take power. Whereas Keir Starmer has just been the only person in opposition to try and reform to get us ready for the next election. So, I mean, Kinnock's position, really, without him, we'd have maybe new. I mean, there's so many counterfactuals there as to what could have happened if John Smith had lived. Of course, a completely different story again. But it seems like the reform that was under John Smith and also under Kinnock was a massive, massive part of our history, isn't it?
You're right, Dan. That actually, I think the heavy lifting of internal reform of the party happens well before Tony Blair comes onto the scene. It is Neil Kinnock. Now, this period of opposition, so most of the chapters we take from the fall of the Labour government to the next Labour government as a discrete chapter. But for this period from 1979 to 1997, we actually have to write two chapters about it because so much happens, and it's 18 years. And what we decided to do actually was we thought, how do we break this up? Do we do a chapter on Foot, and then do we do Kinnock, Smith, Blair, or do we do Foot and Kinnock and then Smith and Blair? And we actually thought what we're going to do is we're going to split Kinnock's leadership in half. So we're going to do 1979 to 87 and 87 to 97, because the first half of Kinnock's leadership is basically focused internally on getting the party, the party's act together internally. This is the famous confrontation with the militant tendency. Kinnock is basically devoting those first 5 years of his leadership to trying to get the National Executive Committee to come on board with his approach to leadership. And it's really after the 87 election that Kinnock focuses then on policy reform, and he has his policy reviews. And this is where Labour drops some of its commitments, like withdrawal from the EEC, its support for unilateral nuclear disarmament, its views on nationalization soften, and the policy modernization for Kinnock does not happen until about 5 years into his leadership. And not many, Kinnock was opposition leader for a long time, from 83 to 92, 9 years. It's a long period to be opposition leader. Many opposition leaders don't get a second crack of the whip after they lose an election, but Kinnock did. And that was really important for Kinnock in almost having two stages of reform. And that's when we look at those challenges, you've got to do the inward work before you do the outward work with the electorate and your appeal to the electorate, which Kinnock did.
Our leaders, though, that I feel they have a particularly hard job, because the events that go on in the country, like the miners' strike, for instance, really do put us in a very awkward position where there's no ballot held, for instance. So Kinnock couldn't officially go and support the miners' strike, although unofficially, I guess the party was supporting them, and members certainly were. It's those events which I don't feel like the Conservatives get that in opposition. I feel like the Conservatives are almost in isolation. Businesses and their interests and are not like trade unions and our interests. So it just seems like he was completely affected by the events in society, which meant that he was trying to pull things together all the time in that first term. But events were overtaking him quite often.
Because I suppose one thing that's so different about Labour from both the Tories and any other party in Britain is our unique relationship with the trade unions, being a party where the trade unions are not only have this historic role of having founded the party, but are actually formally embedded in the structures of the party. And so the trade unions have representation on our National Executive Committee. They make up half of the votes at party conferences. They have a role in the nomination process for parliamentary candidates, right? There's lots of kind of formal ways that the unions fund the party to a large extent. And so the Labour Party has to see the unions both as part of it, but also the unions are operating for slightly different reasons. I mean, the unions ultimately are there to represent their members and to get the best deal they can for their members. And the Labour Party is trying to win elections. And you can't just rely on trade union members to get you elected. So Labour also has to appeal to non-trade union voters to win an election. And this is again going back to the 1920s. This is a common struggle and problem that Labour faces throughout its history. And indeed, of course, even right up to the present day, Keir Starmer has had to manage how he relates to industrial action from various unions that we've seen tick up in the kind of post-COVID economy, and it's a very difficult one for all Labour leaders.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to ask, then I'm going to bring up to the modern period, well, modern-ish, 2010 to today. The thing I think, again, I feel like it's a Labour Party problem, although Liz Truss is doing something similar at the moment for her party. But it seems like we have a tendency to, as you said at the very beginning, actually, defend the record of the previous government or challenge the previous government's record and pick apart the problems. I very much feel like with the new Labour era, instead of being nuanced and saying there are fantastic things and there are negative things, there seems to be a massive swing to say it was all terrible for a while. And and that seems like, we don't almost need an opposition sometimes, because I feel like we are able to do that ourselves and say and hold a spotlight to ourselves and say, look how terrible that was. We're going to be different. Is that a particular Labour problem, would you say? Is that something that has been a continual theme? And certainly I feel like Ed Miliband's time as leader, that was unfortunately the kind of the conversation that was happening.
Yeah, we call the final chapter, substantive chapter of the book, In the Shadow of New Labour. And actually, a colleague of mine at Queen Mary, Carl Pike, is also publishing a book this month called Getting Over New Labour, which is a book-length treatment of this period. And we very much believe that the Labour Party, the fights of Labour and opposition, possibly until now, have been really about that legacy, how to understand the legacy of that Labour government. From people who view that Labour government as a roaring success, to people who see it as a mixed bag, to people who see it as some people pretend it's not even a Labour government. They see it as something outside. And we believe, in that chapter, we say that began as soon as Labour lost the 2010 election, that first 2010 leadership contest. We believe that the divisions between the two Miliband brothers, Ed and David, really was that David wanted to champion the legacy of that Labour government, and Ed wanted to move on from it. And Ed, he comes in, and one of his first acts is a symbolic act where on the URL of the party, it's no longer new.labour.org.uk, it's just labour.org.uk. And Ed says repeatedly through his campaign that he wants to move on from New Labour. But that's that's easier said than done. And to just kind of to move on from it, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that you repudiate everything that the previous Labour government did? Does that mean that you adopt a different approach, but you accept some of the good and the bad? And really, even in 2015, in the 2015 election, we include quotes from Ed Miliband during that campaign, where Ed Miliband basically tries to disassociate himself from that Labour government to an electorate that then is rather confused because he was in the previous Labour government, that surely Labour is to a certain extent still running on its record in government compared to what the coalition government had done. And then of course Jeremy Corbyn's candidacy in a way is to bury New Labour entirely. I mean, that's sort of what his whole kind of positioning is, that everything that Labour government did in a sense was flawed. But even in Corbyn's leadership, there are certainly things that then Corbyn starts to say, we want to bring back Sure Start. Well, who brought in Sure Start, right? And so there wasn't a proper reckoning with New Labour that we think was ultimately very damaging for this most recent period of opposition. There wasn't a willingness to have a nuanced conversation. And actually, I think that goes almost for both sides. That, I've talked about the left critique, but the right of the party also became somewhat solidified and calcified that Tony Blair could do no wrong. And, we just, if we can just do what Blair did, then everything will be wonderful and great as well. And what you really need is you need a figure who can come in and sort of say, look, I'm a modernizer, that, I'm bringing Labour up. We're in a new period to where Labour was in 1997, which now feels a long time ago. But there are lots of proud achievements of that government. There are things that we wouldn't do again. It's a difficult conversation to have, but it's a necessary one, I think, because otherwise the public are very confused as to, what is this party that doesn't actually believe in anything that the party has previously done?
Yeah, exactly. Why should we believe what they're saying if they don't believe what they've done is good in the first place? And also, it just helps the opposition. So Julian Huppert, who was the MP here for the Liberal Democrats, he was saying to me years ago how there were some bad things in Labour, but actually he said we're talking at our conference, at the Liberal Democrat conference, about all the amazing achievements of that government. I was like, well, that's not happening at our conference. Like, what it is now. But it seems crazy the Lib Dems were reflecting on that and we weren't, which was really interesting. Of course, I forgot when I talked about the personal rivalries and the egos, I forgot Miliband versus Miliband. That, again, seems to be a big part of that falling out there, doesn't it? One thing, Richard, I appreciate time is ticking, so we're coming to the end of our time together, but it seems to me one of the problems we have as a party, I don't just talk about problems all the time, is and the press are talking about the next general election as being, is it a 97? Is it a 92? Is it a whatever election you want to compare it with? We do not do that with the Conservatives. We don't say, oh, Cameron was clearly going to be a 1951. We just don't think of it in those terms. I think apart from Boris Johnson, who tried to make himself, Churchill for a while there. But we seem to be, I think, more tied to our history in that regard and our relationship to the country, rather than just being a new option for a new era. Am I analysing that too much? Is this just rhetoric, or do you actually think there's something behind that?
I think Labour is a very nostalgic party. And it's perhaps somewhat understandable, I suppose. To be on the left is to have a certain degree of sentimentality about the country that you live in and the people you live among, and a certain idealism about the world and what it can be. And I think also Labour has always seen itself as a vehicle for social justice, as Harold Wilson said, a moral crusade. And therefore, people in Labour tend to be, I think, prouder of its history. I know we've just talked about how Labour is very self-critical, but there's also a sense of those where Labour is critical of its past, it's because that past is seen to be as a deviation from true Labour, whatever that might be. And that there's a sense within the Labour Party that Labour, the true values of Labour, however we might define and understand those, are inherently good and just. And what, our greatest achievements through our history have been when we've kept to those values. And I don't think other parties, when I talk to people in other parties, they don't relate to their party in the same way. Being in the Labour Party is like being part of a dysfunctional family, and
the dysfunctional bit, yeah, okay.
But you love your family for all of its dysfunctional elements. You love it, and you can't explain why you love it. It is just part of you. And I think for those who are in and of the party, you understand that. I'm sure you feel that way to a certain extent, Dan, as well. I certainly feel it, and I feel it through the connection. This book, we dedicated this book to my grandfather, the one I mentioned, who spoke at the 1952 Morecambe conference. My grandfather was a Labour councillor for many years. He stood for Parliament a couple of times. He was someone who gave an enormous amount of his time and energy for these causes, which some of them he saw realized in his lifetime and others he didn't. And we all do that in Labour. We give up something of ourselves to a cause that we believe is greater than ourselves. And that can get Labour in trouble as well. I mean, I think people outside the party can sometimes think this sounds slightly mad, but it's also extremely motivating. And I think it's why Labour does so well in terms of activists, and just the number of activists, the sheer dedication of Labour activists, is partly because of this almost irrational sentimentality, nostalgia, love of the party.
Yeah, and you know what? I just want to reflect on that very point there. There's a lady we know, both of us know very, very well, Marie Ferguson-Smith, who, regardless, if it's Kinnock, Blair, Miliband, Corbyn, she would be in Alexwood Hall, the headquarters in Cambridge, entering data on the system, printing the leaflets, folding and sealing the letters. And it's that family, isn't it? It doesn't matter who's in the leader. We are still the same people who are active, who are standing, who are campaigning, knocking on doors, because of that exact vision of hope for the future, that things will be better for our society than they were in the past, that we can be the progressive party for change. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I do like the idea of the dysfunctional family, who, by the way, are my listeners. So don't take that personally, guys. It's meant with love from fellow family. We're just cousins on the outskirts here talking about our family, okay? Now, I was just going to ask you, as we are wrapping up there, two questions. One's a bit of a fun one I'll come to in a moment. But the first one is about this theme, really. It seems like there are definite patterns here, even though there might be some, slight changes. And, looking back now at the period of 2010, 2015, and, it just seems a bit strange looking back that actually happened again and again and again. Maybe 2015 and the leadership election then was actually pretty similar to what was going on in 1952, really. So when you look back on that, how do you feel about that pattern? Is that gives you hope and optimism, or is there something a bit depressing about it all?
Well, it does show to me, I think, that in a way that I hadn't seen before writing this book, was that many of the problems that Labour faces are structural, and they come from the way that the party has been set up and its processes. It comes from the way that the members relate to the party, as we've just discussed. It also is a feature, I think, of the electoral system that we have. I'm a defender of the electoral system, but what it does mean is it forces, in effect, two parties to be broad church or big tent parties where people of many different, varying viewpoints inhabit and vie for influence within the party. And I think that is good, actually, because I think that means that it makes the parties much more pluralist. It forces them to think of a wider set of opinions. And I also think that when it comes to an election, voters are much clearer as to what they're voting for when the parties put forward their policy programs. But what it does mean is it's an enormous challenge for party leaders to have to manage those disagreements. And some leaders have done it much better than others. I do believe that Attlee and Wilson, for me, were both figures, and Wilson perhaps even more so than Attlee, but Attlee also, who knew how to make everyone feel loved to a certain extent within the party. There was something that he could kind of give out to everyone. Now that's not easy. Having a shadow cabinet with people from different wings of the party can also mean that you have a shadow cabinet where they're fighting like cats in a sack. And Jeremy Corbyn had this problem in the early years of his leadership, where he actually did have quite a mixed shadow cabinet in his first year as leader before the leadership challenge. And he really struggled with that because he didn't have, the respect of people across the party, because he'd been a bit of a factional fighter himself. So then he becomes leader, and then it's sort of like, well, it's fair game then. So, I think that's an instruction for all Labour leaders, past, present, and future. Is if you want to be very successful, and I think thinking not just in the immediate term, it might be easy in the immediate term to have a kind of narrowly focused team around you who are all on the same page ideologically. But I think for the longer term, if you want the party and the movement more broadly to buy into what you're doing, and to become protective of your government when it goes through the rough patches, I think you want everyone, 85% of the party to feel like they're part of that mission.
Fantastic. And the final question I have is a nice music-based one. I want you to imagine that one day Desert Island Discs from the Radio 4 program gets in touch and says, Richard, we're sending you off to a desert island. Shows you how much the BBC has been cut these days. It's probably not a desert island anymore. It's probably just a holiday camp on the outskirts of Norfolk somewhere. But you're going to be sent there, and you have to take with you a song, your favourite song. What would it be?
So I'm not sure this is my favorite song, but I just thought this would be appropriate for this podcast because it is a political song and a bit of a banger, which is the official anthem of the Australian Labor Party in its 1972 election, where Gough Whitlam was elected Labor Prime Minister. And the song is called "It's Time." And I think it's an appropriate song for the Labour Party today as well, especially for a podcast being listened to by PPCs. It's time for a Labour government. So that would be my song choice.
It's time. Well, that's going to be added to the Spotify playlist Doorstep Win 24. Richard, it has been superb, this conversation today. Thank you so much for your time in your busy schedule in America right now. The book out is on the 20th, or certainly it's around this weekend. It's coming out. So this is going out at the same time the weekend the book's coming out. So go and get your copies. You can pre-order, I think, as well, can't you? And then it will be sent to you as soon as it's published.
Absolutely. Yep. Bookshops, pre-order, by hook or by crook, find your copy.
Excellent stuff. Well, take care, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Dan. I really enjoyed it.
Before I go, may I ask a massive favour? Like this podcast and smash that subscribe button. Leave a review. Share this podcast with other Labour Party members, your CLPA executive, and anyone who, like us, wants to fight for the next Labour government our country so desperately needs. If you're a candidate and wish to come onto the show, then email me at labourpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, bye for now.